So, I've been here across the pond in Britain, sipping on tea and watching the decline of Western civilization, which got me thinking, which of these 16 types are most likely to become president? Now, as always, this video is brought to you by zero reason, research, or logic. And by all means, feel free to argue these points in the comments. Okay, let's start with ISFP. ISFPs are lovers of freedom, and although, in theory, the position of president should be the defender of freedom, I think that the idea of having to compromise their life in the way that seeking this office requires is deeply off-putting to them. Also, having TE as an inferior function is going to be quite tricky when there's clear benefits to being organizationally minded. I think that an ISFP is highly unlikely to become president. Maybe they shouldn't even be governed by any president either. We should just let them be wild and free. Okay, let's do ISTJ next. ISTJs are strong, stable, likely to support many of the institutions of government. They tend to value the integrity of the systems of society as a whole, and they are pretty no-nonsense in their approach to things. That being said, they might not always capture the imagination of the public, and are more likely to gain popularity after an extended period of disruption, where there's a public appetite for something more secure. I think they're a good generic presidential archetype in many ways, but they would struggle against a more charismatic opponent. I'm going to put ISTJs in the possible category for now. Maybe I'll change that later. Also, there's a decent chance that most, if not all of these types, have already in fact been president. So if you were thinking of running, don't let this video put you off. Let's look at INFP next. I view INFPs as being outsiders in many ways. People who make their biggest impact by circumventing conventionality. They are very good at drawing attention to the flaws in society, and that can be through art or simply the way they choose to live their life. So the thought of them being in a role that is the epitome of the establishment is kind of odd to me. They also generally dislike positions of leadership or having any kind of power over other people's lives. So it's probably not a role they're even likely to seek to begin with. I think I'm going to have to put INFPs alongside their FI Dom brethren and say highly unlikely. Let's do ESTP next. Okay, this one's going to be controversial. I think this is an excellent type for president. Maybe that seems like an unusual thing to say, given how relentless the role of president is and how quickly the landscape can change, particularly in the modern age. Being an SE Dom is very useful. Relying on the achievements of last year or even last week in politics is going to backfire. So taking things one day at a time is definitely rewarded in my view. You need to fight every day, fend off attacks. Essentially, you need to be in the moment as much as possible. Or should I say, there are clear advantages to operating that way. I haven't studied the presidents enough in detail to be confident about their types, but hearing Lyndon Johnson's story and how he worked his way up, and his approach to things in general, make me think ESTP definitely fits for him. I do also think that Trump is an ESTP. That's a very good fit for Teddy Roosevelt and also for Kennedy. So although on the face of it, it might seem like an odd fit, I do think this is one of the best types for seeking the presidency. Navigating the ever-changing waters of public opinion, adapting to the unexpected, being rational, pragmatic. Of course, like every type, they have weaknesses and drawbacks, which will be exacerbated in that position. But ultimately, I'm going to put ESTPs in the highly likely to become president category. Okay, let's do ISTP. ISTP is a bit of a tricky one. They tend to lean towards wanting less government interference in their lives. I feel like they'd run as libertarian candidates, which kind of by definition rules them out. They'd certainly be tough-minded and pretty adaptable as well. Having extroverted intuition as a blind spot might be difficult when dealing with so many people that have hidden agendas, equally with having FE inferior. The political side of politics might not suit them at all. I feel like ISTPs are more likely to assassinate a president than become one. So I'm going to go with unlikely for now. Let's do INTP next. This is a very interesting one and brings up an issue that I think applies to quite a few of the types. It depends on what point in history they'd be running. In the modern age, or at least over the last few years, I don't think INTPs are going to do very well. The sheer amount of blatant lying is something that INTPs can understand from a pragmatic or strategic perspective, but actually doing it, standing up in front of people and saying something that you know to be logically incorrect or inconsistent is going to be something that's very hard to sustain. I think the fast-paced nature of the role is going to rob them of the time they need to figure out the best approach, and the constant low-level political game playing is going to be very irritating. I have seen Lincoln typed as an INTP before, or possibly an ISTP as well. He's someone who is astonishingly egoless in his approach, which is definitely something a mature INTP could do, simply figuring out what was the most logical approach and following that as their North Star. So a mature INTP who understands the pragmatic nature of playing politics could certainly do well. And I think that if we cycle back to a time of being post-truth, then there's a much better chance. When I think back to the Founding Fathers and the Constitution, being able to spend time working out these logical principles, simulating future scenarios, and trying to account for them, that seems like something that would be very appealing for INTPs. Coming up with the logical and principled framework to base an entire nation off. As for the day-to-day relentlessness of being president, right now I'm going to say unlikely. Okay, let's look at INFJs next. Empathy is always a useful skill when it comes to tapping into what people are worried about and what kind of change they'd like to see in the world. But politics, the vast majority of the time, is a pretty divisive endeavour. I wonder what an INFJ would do when confronted with the fact that people are often too tribal to ever be reconciled. INFJs are definitely capable of being unifiers, and there are plenty of historical examples of seemingly irreconcilable groups being brought together by a great leader. In my experience, INFJs tend to prefer one-on-one interactions as a way of helping people. They're more likely to be the advisor or counsellor of a leader, perhaps. I'm going to go for possible for INFJs. Okay, so ENFJs. My gut reaction is that ENFJs make great leaders from a communicative perspective, and that is a disproportionately powerful trait to have when it comes to getting elected. Having third slot SE makes them able to adapt to the changeable nature of the role, and balancing the interpersonal side and the abstract ideas, I'd say will be pretty simple for them. I think that ENFJs might have the tendency to lean into the rhetorical aspects of the role, as opposed to focusing on pure problem solving. They also might struggle in situations where they need to cause tension or disharmony. Nonetheless, I think they are ultimately well suited, and I'm going to go with likely. Let's do ENTPs next. I think ENTPs are going to be hit or miss for this role. When it comes to their capabilities, I think they're pretty perfect. They aren't going to struggle with the debates. They'll happily engage in seeing things from the perspective of opposing sides, which is very helpful on many levels, possibly for bipartisanship, or simply to outplay their opponents. Plus, they have just about enough FE to wheel out the charm when needed. Their problem might come from the sheer, unavoidable bureaucracy involved. They're going to want to innovate, update, and potentially revolutionize things. But that kind of stuff can quickly gain lots of opposition. So in some sense, their main strength is going to be sort of hampered by the institutions of government. Freedom and flexibility is ironically not something that comes with the role. So they might be very torn on whether they'd even enjoy being president. In some ways, it offers the ability to make an entire country your playground, but it does come with lots of obligations and restrictions. I'll also put them in possible. Okay, let's do ISFJ next. Again, like ISTJs, I can picture them being a good generic president. They'd resonate with the notion of the president being the ultimate public servant. And as a rule, I think they'd be pretty sympathetic. Having TE as a blind spot could be tricky, and they might struggle in situations where some out-of-the-box thinking is needed. This is tricky because I want to go with likely, but I think they belong in possible. Let's do ESFJ next. So, would ESFJs be better or worse than ISFJs? I think that extroversion is clearly an advantage. Being able to put on a smile with all of those non-stop casual encounters with people is such a draining prospect for introverts. Being an FE Dom with valued NE is a nice combo for navigating the human dynamics. It's possible they could lack an overall vision for the country, and like their ENFJ counterparts, might avoid getting into the details of complex problem solving. Sometimes detached and impersonal decisions need to be made, based simply on data. That might be a struggle for them sometimes. Let's be nice to them and say likely. Okay, let's do ENTJ next. Healthy and mature ENTJs really are well built for leadership. They have all of the organizational skills, can adapt well, they like solving problems, and they are idea people. Their problem comes when they have repeated success and fall into being an unquestionable authority. This can result in them no longer surrounding themselves with dissenting voices. If ENTJs can stay humble, then I think they can be great. I'm going to go for highly likely for ENTJs, since they are naturally drawn to these kinds of positions. Okay, let's do INTJ next. Most INTJs I know like to talk about the flaws of society on all levels, and of course, how they'd solve them. So I think INTJs would make great presidents, but would they be able to get there? So often just in life, but also in politics. People claim to have a strategy, but it's usually just a plan, or vague ambitions or aims. INTJs would try to maximize every advantage they had. They probably have an excellent ground game and would construct good teams around them. Connecting with people on an emotional level or having that kind of visceral impact might be something that is difficult for them. There's also the question of desire. The person in the spotlight is rarely the person with the most power, not least because they're pulled in so many different directions and are subject to a lot of distractions. As a result, INTJs might favour behind-the-scenes power roles. Nonetheless, I think a well-developed INTJ could show their emotional side when needed to not look completely like a robot. So I'm going to say likely for INTJs. Okay, let's do ESFP next. Great improvisers, energetic, forceful when needed. They're action-oriented and tend to inspire action as well from others. They tend to communicate in a very straightforward and easy-to-understand way, sometimes to a fault, where they simplify something that should be more complex or nuanced. I think Bill Clinton is an example of the brilliant charisma of ESFPs, and also the impulsivity and the recklessness. They're so compelling in the moment that they can distract from their flaws, in this case relating to policy perhaps. I think that if you have an ESFP who is trained in politics and is surrounded by a good team, they can be a real force to be reckoned with. Often they'll be their own worst enemy once elected, but they can burn that bridge when they get there. I'm going to go with highly likely for ESFPs. They're just going to be good at so many of the things that would drain or derail other people. Okay, ENFPs. ENFPs just seem too weird to become president. They are people who can basically connect with anyone, but it's hard to imagine them pigeonholing themselves into such a position. Whereas ESFPs are likely to cut through with their clear and down-to-earth messaging, ENFPs might seem too off-the-wall and eccentric. I feel like they're more likely to be the journalist that breaks some big scandal that brings the government down, rather than being at the top of the establishment. I'm going to have to go with highly unlikely. Okay, finally we've got ESTJs. Everyone's favourite boss or manager. I think their skill set just translates very well into running a government. They're going to come across as the ultimate strong and stable choice, which is something that is rarely out of fashion for leadership. They want to get things done, make sure things are organised and set up efficiently. They have a preference for traditionalism, but are not really beholden to it since they have good NE. They can definitely lean towards being belligerent in their worst moments, but they probably embrace the statesperson-like role, getting things done efficiently, being dutiful, not to be confused with beautiful, being workmanlike, respecting systems and traditions without being stuck in your ways. I think this is a very strong archetypical presidential type. I'm going to say highly likely. This is the part where I realise there is no logic to this ranking. Let's see. So we've got some high FI users down at the bottom. Sorry guys. Some high TI users in the unlikely category. Possible, let's see, balanced TI and FE, interesting. Maybe the one that stands out to me as being misplaced is ISTJ. Maybe INTJs are a bit too high, but you know, don't want you guys to get mad with me. So the top row, high SE or high TE. Those functions are ones that classify as being the most action-oriented. I actually think that TE DOMs are more action-oriented than SE DOMs. That might seem unusual to say, but to use TE, you actually have to get things done, whereas you can passively enjoy SE-like activities. So I shall see you all down in the comments where we can argue about this. Please like and subscribe. That makes a really big difference to the channel. Also in the description below, we have links to our Discord server, our website and Patreon, where you can donate to us or get typed, or both. Also, there's some individual social media links, such as an Instagram and a blog, etc.